It is yet another time that we return to the sweet and familiar embrace of Netflix. Within the grander narrative of pop culture, Netflix has become synonymous with content mills, releasing heaps of content with neither taste nor substance. Not without reason, of course, but it has become all too easy to dunk on the platform. Just lament about how awful the platform is and watch the views pour in. So for a change of pace, let's do something different. After all, a broken clock is right twice a day. The subject of today's video, a TV show from the platform titled The Diplomat, is one such rare strike. Admittedly, I didn't particularly seek it out, nor did I see any trailers beforehand. I stumbled upon it by accident, and I was gripped. Rarely does a show click with me in the way that The Diplomat did. It was rather a pleasant surprise. While the name of the show is as impressive as a glass of water, funny considering that BBC dropped a show titled The Diplomat literal weeks from the show, the contents of the show are way more appealing. The Diplomat traces its history back to January of 2022, when Netflix announced it has given a series order. With the show coming from Deborah Cahn, coming from a show like The West Wing, made sense to be a showrunner for a show such as this. Soon enough, it was announced that Keri Russell would star, with castings also including the likes of Rufus Sewell and other faces that you might find familiar. Things seemed to go well, and well they did. The show premiered its first season on April 20th of 2023, and to some nice amounts of success. It reached high ranks on Netflix, enough so for the benevolent overlords to grant it a second season. Season 2 also performed nicely, granting the show a third. As astounding as it may be that Netflix didn't axe yet another successful show, it certainly thus far has delivered 2 quite interesting seasons of The Diplomat. So let's allow ourselves to dig in and see how exactly the show ticks. Since this is a political thriller drama, the show doesn't shy away from drawing its inspiration heavily from real life to construct its chessboard. It borrows a great deal of political dynamics from our world, as well as constructs some of its political figures in parallel to real-world figures. However, the main event that spurs the narrative into motion is completely fictional. The show opens with a British attack carrier called HMS Courageous being attacked in the Persian Gulf. It is explained that the tensions between the United States and Iran have been high. The attack is a tragedy that takes the lives of 41 sailors, so it is only natural that a lot of international chaos ensues. The tragedy also leaves a great deal of unknowns. It is unclear as to who exactly launched the attack. There are only suspicions and educated guesses. Since the object that was attacked belongs to the United Kingdom, the White House is quick to react. Apparently, the Winfield House is yet to be occupied by a new ambassador from the United States for the United Kingdom. So the White House decides to appoint a certain someone into the place of an ambassador for London. Enter Hal Wyler. Catherine, or most commonly referred to within the show as Kate, is a career diplomat who gets involved in this crisis solely because she was requested by the president to take up the ambassadorship. At the start of the show, she was on her way to Kabul to be the ambassador for the US there. Yet in lieu of the attack on the HMS Courageous and the fact that the position of the ambassador for the United Kingdom is vacant, Kate is assigned to take the spot, and reluctantly, she steps up to the task. The very first scenes of her being asked and reluctantly accepting already quite nicely set up the whole dynamic for the show. Kate is immediately characterized as feeling most comfortable in crises and dealing with more dangerous endeavors. She's set up as having quite a lot of strategic acumen in diffusing difficult situations. She also prefers to work behind the scenes, and it is those situations that she herself clearly thrives in the most. It would seem that those skills are exactly what would make her perfect for the current developing situation within the narrative. However, as the show explains, the ambassadorship in London has a ceremonial aspect in it. Appearances and pageantry are shown to be an important part of the job. With appearances and pageantry also comes a great deal of indirectness and additional steps, and it is this aspect exactly that is completely foreign to Kate. She is shown to completely resent being a ceremonial puppet, as she prefers to work more so behind the scenes. The pilot episode puts her right into the fire by creating a situation where she absolutely has to be front and center in front of the cameras. We see more of her character revealed. She can be quite abrasive and outspoken about her discomfort in this new sphere. She is set in her ways and is reluctant to bend to what this new position requires. It can also be understood that it is exactly this character makeup that allowed for her to thrive in her previous postings. It is not hard to imagine her no-nonsense pragmatism being paramount for third-world danger danger zones, but this new job requires way more delicacy than Kate can afford. In a sense, Kate is our reluctant hero, and her frustration makes perfect sense. Her frustration, however, is only further amplified by the people around her. Since ambassadorship in the UK carries way more weight, there are way more steps and wires that characters around her may seem to constantly trip over and she herself is boggled down by. Then there is also the matter of her husband Hal, an agent of chaos that is also quite a large source of frustration. He is also, just like Kate, a career diplomat that used to himself be an ambassador. He represents an interesting balance to Kate. Unlike her, he revels in all the things she does not. He is not shy of cameras or pageantry, or of playing the game. He is quite scheming. He is a constant source of chaos for Kate. In a way, they weirdly balance each other out, with Kate being more an agent of order rather than chaos that Hal constantly engages in. Yet Kate is our constantly frustrated, reluctant hero. Not to the T, of course. She isn't always as heroic as the word might suggest, but she does fill in the role she is required to fill in. The narrative construct that underpins the show is quite perfect for this type of character. She's a fish out of the water, and she has a clear arc to undergo in order to change and fit in. But the story is not really a story without an antagonistic force. We have our hero, and we certainly need our villain. From this point of view, that is really what the plot revolves around, answering the question of who exactly is our villain here. First and foremost, I believe it is important to point something out. The show currently has 2 seasons. Season 1 has 8 episodes, and Season 2 has 6. This show is yet another victim of a plague that has been widespread in contemporary television. Not enough episodes within a season. The 2 seasons of the show are not really 2 seasons. They read more like part 1 and part 2 of the same story. Season 1 finishes in the middle of a narrative, which can certainly be frustrating. But it is an interesting case, as it only really becomes apparent that this is the case because of Season 2. We will circle back to this idea a bit later though. The narrative presented within the Diplomat has 2 main threads. The first one is Kate trying to uncover who exactly carried out the attack on the HMS Courageous. This is the main propelling force within the narrative. It gives a certain mystery for the characters to uncover. The second overarching thread is Kate being prepared for potentially becoming the Vice President of the United States. A lot of the plot of the show is also spurred into action by the people around Kate plotting for her to become the VP. The show explains that the current VP, Penn, will soon be leaving office, as there was some compromising information bound to come out about her husband's dealings. This at first is not something that Kate herself is aware of, but the plot is incredibly airtight in this regard. This whole tragedy is of a large enough magnitude to be perfect litmus test to see whether Kate would be a good fit for the role. From a narrative standpoint, the mystery of who had done the attack feeds wonderfully into her being tested for the role of VP. What we see throughout the season is exactly this. Kate is put through the ringer in her endeavor to uncover who carried out the attack. Brick by brick, it builds an overarching argument that she might as well be suited for the job she is being eyed to take. In many ways, her refusal to overcomplicate things and being straightforward is an asset. She cuts to the chase and presents solutions that are pragmatic, and for her, it usually works out, and to a great extent. Even some of the most outlandish ideas of her seems to ultimately lead to desired results. Throughout her run, she also establishes bonds with the likes of the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Dennison. Their bond also gains a romantic undertone, as there is seemingly undeniable chemistry between the two of them. They work great together as a team, it would seem. She also forms a bond, if you can call it that, with a certain woman named Margaret Roylin, against the wishes of one of her main advisors, Stuart. She's explained to be a person not to be associated with, and that seems to work out in her favor too. The first season indulges in a simple fantasy.
Can you imagine hiring someone for a key governing position just because you think they'd be good at it?
What if someone who was actually competent and cared enough came into this type of a job? As a candidate for a VP, she comes off rather strong. At least, the show sure does attempt to present her as such, sometimes to a comedic extent. While her character is sometimes rather questionable within this context, whatever solutions she has usually seem to work. She manages to convince a lot of people of her skill. She even seems to have insane amounts of insight into everything. Generally, she seems rather OP within the narrative. Some may even go as far as to call her a bit of a Mary Sue. Does she have difficulty in adjusting with this new world? Yes, certainly. But the show doesn't exactly spin it in the negative direction. A lot of her struggles to adjust either are played off as her being this tough person that gains her respect, or are shown off to be not that bad in the end, since she still comes up with some insane out-of-the-box solution. As for the chase after the culprits behind the initial attack on the ship, she even seemingly manages to entangle that web as well. With a slight amount of repetition, the show goes through multiple suspects, yet Kate ultimately lands on the version that was was never even considered, and the most outrageous, that it was none other than the British Prime Minister who staged an attack on his own ship. This revelation comes right at the very end of the first season and serves as both a shocking cliffhanger and seemingly an answer to the mystery, and I really must hand it to them. Some of the character writing in this show is truly unpredictable and in a good sense. From what we have seen of the aforementioned Prime Minister of the United Kingdom named Nicol Throwbridge, the reveal very well could be made true or not. There is enough evidence in there to suggest that he might be, or he may not be behind the attack at all. On top of this cliffhanger revelation, we also get an explosion of a car. This occurs because Kate's husband, Hal Wyler, is contacted by a British MP. Kate's office objects to this, and two people from Kate's office as well as Hal end up on the scene of the explosion, and all three of them get seriously injured. This makes for quite a finale, but I would rather for us to look at it not as a finale at all, because with the additional context of Season 2, it doesn't really finalize anything. In more conventional narrative terms, this is more of a midway point twist, more than anything, and what comes after is quite interesting. It is during the second season, or rather the second half of this narrative, that we see all of the setup and argumentation of Kate becoming the VP being slowly undone. You see, throughout the first season, one of Kate's strengths was the things that she knew. She knew people, she forged bonds, she exchanged information. She already had much experience and therefore, in contrast to others, seemed to be quite smart and competent. The second part is really about the things that she does not know or has the wrong idea about. Take for instance the conclusion that she comes to about Throwbridge, about him being the culprit behind the attack. The way she comes to that conclusion is seemingly logical from what we are presented with in the show. However, that doesn't change the fact that it ultimately ends up being wrong. She is proven to be completely incorrect in this conviction. Yet it is exactly this conviction that she holds for quite some time within the second season. You can see that she has a basis for it, but it is a basis that she clung onto rather swiftly. The main mistake that she commits while holding this theory, which becomes her undoing, is that she is rather swift to voice it. As soon as she connects the dots, she tells the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Austin Dennison. Dennison is shown to be sick of Throwbridge, since Throwbridge is chaotic and doesn't really listen to anyone. Kate knows that there is history between Dennison and Throwbridge, therefore she should have been more careful with letting that particular genie out of the bottle. The show quite correctly displays that Dennison freaks out over this and begins trying to seek justice, at least in part due to his predisposition towards Throwbridge. It is also interesting to note that her suspicion is not exactly based upon what she just herself sees and encounters. While Throwbridge might seem a tad animated and standoffish and also a misogynist, he has never really expressed any sentiment that could incriminate him that much. The hilarious thing is that throughout the 2 seasons he has been consistently shown to seek justice for the tragedy. The only instance that came close to him being suspicious is him ordering a murder of the person who carried out the attack instead of an arrest. Yet even that is not entirely clear. The show doesn't concretely state that it was him that ordered it. Kate and Dennison assume so. Yet what we see of him only becomes incriminating because Kate receives information about him from Dennison, a person who already has a colored perspective of the man. She thought she could trust him since they forged a strong bond in the first season, but it is exactly this bond that also opened her for a predisposition and a bias to view these events a certain way. She used her usual approach of cutting through these supposedly needless boundaries and decorum and getting straight to the point. She got involved rather personally in the situation and got a bit carried away by the current, which completely backfired on her. Her accusation brings about a lot of unintended consequences. Dennison, the person that trusted her judgment and took her accusation of Nicol to heart, decides to stop their partnership. He explains that,
"But we have a partnership. That doesn't have to
That
stop."
was a mistake. Do you understand? All of it.
which is completely correct. Dennison, a person who has spent enough time in the post, has enough knowledge and experience to understand that such a partnership shouldn't continue. He quite correctly so realizes that he has a long-standing relation to Nicol and, after all, knows him way better than he knows Kate. Kate, however, is still new to this posting and does not see the situation in the same way as him at all. She's still very keen on continuing, completely blind to the fact that such entanglement has brought a lot of harm. Dennison shoulders a lot of the blame for the situation as well. It is their mutual involvement in this bond that creates the situation. Dennison comes off as too rash in being so quick to believe the theory that Kate proposes. This is absolutely excellent writing, and it is where the show begins falling out of that fantasy of having someone who actually cares and does know how to fix things in place. That sort of position would require a certain person. Kate fits in this regard, but here the show displays that just the virtue of talking to someone honestly and openly and trying to play allies with someone, while great on paper, can also be counterproductive. Then there is also the matter of the explosion. She comes into contact with Margaret Roylin. She's the person that took Nicole under her wing and basically groomed him into becoming the Prime Minister. In the very first episode of the entire show, her Deputy Chief of Mission, Stuart Hayford, warns her of what type of a person Margaret Roylin is.
She takes racists and turns them into lovable guys you wish had time to coach Pee-wee soccer.
Yet even after being told not to associate with her, Kate goes against the advice she was given in Season 1 and establishes contact with Roylin. This ultimately results in the very same explosion that happens at the end of Season 1, which kills a person and injures two. That situation is not without its nuances, of course, considering that it was her husband that had a great deal in setting up that particular situation. Yet it is out of anger towards her husband that she makes that contact. She doesn't take a step back to analyze the situation. She once more rather jumps towards a decision without a second thought, and it backfires on her. Her Deputy Chief of Mission points out as such.
You made a tactical error. I told you who she was. You ignored me. You made a tactical error, and it was deadly.
What I must compliment the show on is the fact that it doesn't shy away from holding Kate accountable. Even Kate herself has enough awareness to understand that the action she committed wasn't the most sensible one. More importantly, she does hold herself accountable, even after her husband tries to convince her otherwise. If you look at the entire narrative, it is this season that Kate faces the reckoning of her own misguided actions. She was largely misguided due to her sticking to her own ways of operating, which is neither surprising nor something you can entirely condemn. After all, she was thrust into this place reluctantly. People schemed all around her to get her into the spot. It is almost expected that she would make mistakes, and I believe that the show overall handles this beautifully. It is a credit to the show that they do not shy away from real consequences for Kate, because it would have been easy to keep on developing the romance between Dennison and Kate, as they do initially have a nice dynamic between them, but that would have only cheapened the show. It would have been easy for the show to gloss over Kate's mistake in confiding in Roylin after she seemingly won everyone over back in Season 1, yet the show doesn't do that, and thus far we have discussed Kate's character throughout mitigating this crisis, but it's still a crisis that was started by someone, and up until the 5th episode of the season, we still do not have our antagonist, our main villain so to speak. We have plenty of misdirects, and middlemen, and false guesses and mercenaries for hire, yet we still have not discussed I want for us to return to the idea of the two overarching threads within the narrative. The first being the tragedy that occurred in the Gulf, and the second being Kate getting ready to potentially become the next vice president. What the show does with the two of them is honestly something both unexpected and entirely predictable. I am almost mad at myself for not piecing it together way sooner. Episode 5 of the second season finally sees the introduction of the person that Kate is being primed to replace, the current vice president of the United States, Grace Penn. Beforehand, we had some throwaway lines about VP here and there. She was described as young, and by young, I suppose they mean anything not geriatric. The show always emphasized the fact that she was about to exit office due to her husband's doings rather than her own misgivings. So at first, the show toys with the idea of them being in an awkward position, seeing that Kate was desired to take Grace's place. However, during their interactions, that is directly acknowledged, yet there is no acrimony between the two women.
I know a thing or two about the job if you have questions.
That's not the situation exactly, and you really don't have to.
This is awkward for me too, if that helps.
They are keeping a level head about it. Kate seems to respect Penn. She even goes as far as to point out how
She was at the table for the Vienna talks in '92. That's like, we talked about it in my A100. That's the example we're all trying to beat.
she also seems willing to take advice and learn from Grace.
As you suggested, I was just trying to look a little more
Vice presidential?
There is also quite an interesting scene that happens between Kate, Grace, PM of the United Kingdom, and the Foreign Secretary.
Sketch out the mud map.
To minimize risk, the Prime Minister can either tell the truth but tell it slowly.
Or you can keep it quiet.
But that's not what I was saying.
Just for a moment, we should consider the Vice President's suggestion.
Oh goodness, I misunderstood the Foreign Secretary. I wasn't suggesting.
We're discussing options.
Later on, when asked about it, Grace explains that
You were inspiring today. You planted his big idea. You told him to bury it. You were leading him to the plan.
I love to take credit, but no, a happy accident.
while she may deny it, Grace seemed awfully suspect in that particular moment, planting ideas in other people's heads so sneakily, especially after being lauded by Kate to be an example to be followed. This, coupled with,
We have an elderly president who just lost the House, and we have a young VP who would be glad to prove she likes to blow things up.
and this,
I think the call is coming from inside the House.
and the direction becomes all too clear. The show does something so astoundingly obvious. It combines the two threads. It synthesizes them by making it so that
Royland hired Lenkoff to shoot a British ship. But Royland didn't come up with the idea. Grace Penn did.
this reveal alone is brilliant. Kate was already being tested to see whether she would be a good fit for the vice presidency. She was given a crisis to solve, and we saw her try and unravel who exactly carried it out. It makes so much narrative sense that this mystery villain, this puppet master behind it all, our final boss within the HMS Courageous saga would be none other than the person she was about to replace. All of this results in a confrontation of sorts between our hero and our supposed villain. Of course, neither of these characters are as binary as that. This scene alone, though, is incredible. When I first saw it, I raved about it for days. The writing, the execution, the acting, the delivery, all of it is amazing. It is also a confrontation that feels very apt, as well as unique through just how much it is fitting within the wider context. Throughout it, Grace Penn proceeds to explain her rationale. It is revealed that the attack on the HMS Courageous was only really meant to be a small attack resulting in just some bent metal and no casualties. Of course, it goes south. Grace explains it as something that was necessary. Democracies are splintering. Scotland is explained to be seeking independence. Characters within the show fear that if Scotland becomes independent, other countries within the United Kingdom would also follow suit. Therefore, this was supposed to be a unifying event. An attack against a vessel belonging to the United Kingdom was supposed to bring everyone together against the supposed common threat, with the Prime Minister Throwbridge being the person to rally behind, and thus averting a potential splintering of the United Kingdom. Of course, the situation is a bit more complicated. I am simplifying for the sake of the review. If you view this confrontation between Grace Penn and Kate Wyler within the context of the entire show being a test for Kate, there is a lot to take away. Upon finding out about Grace being the initiator of the attack, Kate understandably is quick to condemn Grace. And what is particularly interesting is that it is exactly this revelation that pushes Kate to desire the position of the vice presidency. This is surprising considering that she was either enthusiastically against it or on the fence throughout the show up until this point. It would suggest that she believes in her own suitability for the role, especially after finding out Grace's plan. Upon a glance, it makes sense that she holds this belief. Grace's actions are quite foul in her point of view. Kate has been so entrenched in this search for the culprit and learned so many dreadful facts, twists and turns about it, it is only sensible. It also is a bit ironic considering that from the very first episode of the entire show, she, her husband, and others pointed fingers at everyone else.
It was probably Iran.
Please, they're broke.
Who?
Russia, China, ISIS.
Russia's...
When it comes to Grace's explanation for the entire debacle, Grace ultimately points out that
this is my game board. The whole goddamn thing. This is yours. Keep your eyes on your own paper.
And this is an amazing inclusion by the show on multiple levels. It once again emphasizes just how much Kate herself doesn't know, because whether you like it or not, Grace is correct in pointing out that Kate thus far has shown quite a narrow focus. You cannot fault Kate for that. It is not like she was given extensive courses on figuring everything out, but it does emphasize that, at least in that moment, Kate is not quite there to be suited to become the VP. I really like this line in particular, because the entire show thus far has been about Kate's suitability for the role, and between herself and Grace, Kate does seem to lack experience. What happens next is also quite in character for her. After this revelation, she has a conversation with her husband, where she explains the situation and tells Hal that she thinks that Grace is right about Kate not being suitable for the VP.
She should stay. She should keep her job.
In general, this falls in line with what we have already seen beforehand with Kate. It is one of her pitfalls. She seemingly processes the information as it comes and takes it in quite fast and is prone to jumping to conclusions. Even in this instance, she is quick to accept defeat. It takes Hal to explain that what Grace did is not exactly a good decision. While Grace's monologue was certainly imposing and sounded convincing, was it truly valid? At a glance, maybe. But surely there must have been way better ways to deal with the situation other than trying to attack another ship. Kate herself doesn't really stop to consider that. It takes another influence to consider it for her. The situation really emphasizes just how Kate herself is used to working. She worked in higher stakes, riskier situations beforehand that required quick decisions and quick thinking most likely. It makes sense that she operates in this way, but this is exactly what exposes her in the environment that she finds herself in. Additionally, there is quite a lot to be drawn from the way both Grace and Kate interact with others. If you compare how the two of them treat with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, you can see that Grace approaches the situation way more strategically than Kate would. good. Yet another of Kate's downsides is that she herself gets too involved. Under different circumstances, it makes sense that she would approach other diplomats in a less formal and calculated way than Grace, as she most likely is used to exactly that. But we discussed to what type of consequences that close of an involvement can lead. This is not to say that Kate doesn't have the chops to be cautious. She does have her moments where she is careful and calculated in her approach. But I doubt that Grace would have displayed the same approach at all. It is quite telling that while both Kate and Grace interact with Margaret Roylin, Kate gets exploited by Margaret, while Grace uses Margaret to achieve her own ends. Of course, the full fallout of that is yet to be seen, since Margaret was the one to expose who was the mastermind behind it. On the same token, Kate's lack of strategy and close involvement with the foreign secretary could have also been a huge risk. Imagine a scenario where Dennison did have ulterior motives and schemed his own way through and used Kate in the process. The show slightly pokes fun at Kate's perception of Dennison. She tells Hal that
Dennison's probably going to be PM. He might be the best person, like truly decent man I've ever known in politics.
And then Hal later on in the show delivers this line.
He's made mistakes too.
Has he? He's a very good man.
In the context of the show, this is not used to drive home this specific risk or anything like that, but it certainly could have been. While it didn't happen, it still was a very real possibility. So, here we have our reluctant hero and our main villain. A very nice realization about these two characters is that Kate can learn quite a deal from Grace. I would argue that some of Grace's traits would greatly improve Kate. We already saw some of it, for instance how Grace commented on Kate's appearance.
If you're representing the interests of 300 million Americans, it's best to look like the care of your trousers wasn't more than you could manage.
And it is absolutely brilliant to see. Yet, even if it is ultimately revealed that she is our bad guy behind the entire drama, Grace still has tons of experience and acumen to impart upon Kate, even if direct collaboration is rendered impossible after the finale of Season 2. One of my chief complaints remains the fact that they released all of this story in 2 seasons. Now that the 2 seasons are out, it renders this complaint useless a bit, but it was really a counterproductive move to deliver the 2nd season more than a year later. It feels like one of those things that Netflix likes to do nowadays, splitting the seasons in half and releasing them a month apart. Only now, it was way longer of a wait. From the perspective of a person who watched the show as it came out, it was frustrating to tune into Season 2 and have the story barely really move. Sure, we received important developments, but it was more so a payoff to character arcs and plot that were otherwise abruptly ended in Season 1. Yet the show isn't without some other downsides. One of the bigger arguments against the show is the approach that it takes to its subject matter. Politics and diplomacy here is not as intricate, not as deep as they could be. The show paints its picture with fewer strokes instead of attempting to display all possible details and processes. Because you cannot deny that there is a certain simplicity in the way the politics sometimes operate within the show. To an extent, you can regard it as a thematic choice. In the confrontation between Kate and Grace, Grace does tell Kate that
This is my game board, the whole goddamn thing. This is yours. Keep your eyes on your own paper.
If the show does indeed decide to complicate things and make things more meticulous here on after, the simplicity could serve as a way to differentiate the playing fields of an ambassadorship and that of vice presidency. After all, it is only reasonable to assume that the position of an ambassador is not as complicated as a position within the White House. There are also other conveniences to be seen within this approach. The show doesn't really aim to strike for the most solemn tone. It is a political drama and a thriller, and the show chooses an approach that would serve those genres. Real-life politics and diplomacy are not nearly as snappy or exciting as they are depicted in the show. Things are obviously dramatized to keep things moving. Sometimes they do border on ridiculousness. There are instances where the show does bend real-life logic to service its plot. Even at the beginning of the show, Kate getting the post is not the most realistic thing to happen. Diplomatic processes in the show are constantly simplified. If you're interested in reading up on it, Politico has a nice article about all that, backed with testimonies of actual diplomats. One could argue that trying to be overly meticulous could bog down the show way too much, and all that excitement that the current show produces would be drained by the uninteresting minutiae of real-life politics. So if you're looking for some ultra-realistic depiction of real politics and diplomacy, the show will not give you that, but I doubt that the show ever aimed to do so. Even if it doesn't offer completely accurate depictions, it does offer a world that is relatively well-written and internally consistent. The world building of the show is simply immaculate in that regard. What I particularly like is that that when we are thrown into the narrative of the show, this world feels like it is lived in. It has lore and characters, and those characters have history. It is tightly written and has some of the best foreshadowing in a while. It is also very rewatchable. Actually, it is better that you rewatch it a few times, because there are a lot of details that can be missed the first time around, and there are so many clues and things to be picked up along the way. It is honestly a very rewarding experience throughout. In general, The Diplomat so far is a very solid TV show. From the get-go, it hooked me so hard, and dare I say it, I am very excited to see where it goes from here. Is it an all-time best series? No, it isn't, but it is certainly just a few steps away from a masterpiece for what it wants and tries to achieve.